Dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this panel, The Future of Liberal Democracy in Europe, Political and Legal Perspectives. My name is Ramona Coman. I'm a professor of political science at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And this event is organized as part of the Horizon Europe RED-SPINEL project, a project that I had the pleasure to coordinate together with 11 institutions, both academic and non-academic institutions, a project about the census of liberal democracy in Europe. So our RED-SPINEL project has tried to understand the nature of the census of liberal democracy in Europe, but also the way in which it shapes internal and external policies or the EU's capacity to act both within the European Union and outside. And in this project, what we try to see is first to understand the nature of the census. So we defined it as a conflict between different types of actors, social, political, and legal actors, and the conflict which is about the meaning of liberal democracy, the meaning of values, how we understand today those values. So a conflict over the institutions and the values of this model, and try to see how some actors seek to maintain the status quo, others trying to correct the weaknesses of liberal democracy, and also many other actors wishing to replace or trying to replace liberal democracy with other models, which are very often called alternative models, but very often by alternative models, what is understood is illiberal democracy, which is, in my view, and not only my view, a contradiction in terms, because there is no democracy without rights. So RED-SPINEL tried to understand the nature of the census within the European Union, and not and in relation with specific policy area and specific policy fields. So we looked at, for example, economic governance, climate, migration, but also the rule of law crisis. So this is to understand our focus on the census within the European Union. And then outside the European Union, we looked at the neighborhood and, for example, enlargement, so the role of the European Union in external policies. And the conclusion, to say a few words about the conclusion, is that there is dissensus, so this is not a new aspect, but also what we observed is that it can take different forms, from mild to severe, disruptive or destructive, of course, depending on what is at stake. If at stake it is the ideal of liberal democracy, or if at stake it is more the practice or how liberal democracy is implemented at different levels, and all of this depending on the preferences and the role of the actors, not only political actors, not only EU institutions, but also social and legal actors. Now, of course, for this audience, there is no need to say that we live in a world which is changing, completely changing, and that the pillars of liberal democracy and the pillars of the liberal international order are not only contested, they are also eroded and even dismantled, and that in some parts of the world we have a deep crisis, we could say, of liberal democracy, but in many other parts of the world there is more a new wave or a third wave of autocratization, which is underway, and the EU is no exception. The exercise that we are proposing this evening is a bit new. We are not going to talk about the past, or probably we will talk about the past or the present. The exercise is a bit different, and I would say even more difficult for us, because it involves speaking about the future, something that's we academics tend to avoid, but the times are what they are, and thinking about the future, I think, is also a way of making sense of the present. Questioning the possible futures implies, I suppose, also a better understanding of the current context. So I would say that this is another way for us to ask ourselves, how can liberal democracies defend themselves by liberal democracy, meaning, of course, a political regime which is based on democracy, rights, and the rule of law. So to take on this challenge of thinking about the future of liberal democracy, we have invited two exceptional voices, a political scientist and a legal scholar, both very close to RED-SPINEL because they are both members of the RED-SPINEL International Advisory Board. Next to me, Vivien Schmidt, Jean Monnet Chair and Professor Emerita at Boston University, Honorary Professor at LUIS, and also visiting fellow at the Schumann Center at the European University Institute in Florence. And Vivien Schmidt is a leading theorist of European integration and democracy. Vivien has profoundly shaped debates on EU studies on discursive institutionalism with a new book which will be published in April next year that we had the chance to already read. Thank you very much, Vivien. But also many, many books on democracy and democracy in Europe, democracy in the member states, and also the transformations at the European level. And her work on the centrality of ideas and discourses has really inspired our work in RED-SPINEL. I would limit to just this very, very brief presentation. So thank you very much, Vivien, for accepting our invitation to discuss with us political perspectives and of the future of liberal democracy. And online with us from The Hague, Professor Iulia Motoc, judge at the International Criminal Court and professor of international law. Judge Motoc, prior to joining the International Criminal Court, was a judge at the European Court of Human Rights. She served as UN Special Rapporteur for the Democratic of Congo, reporting on crimes against humanity and war crimes. And she was also a judge at the Constitutional Court of Romania, where she dealt with serious and complex cases, many of them in relation to values and the right to life, and also, for example, at the European Court of Human Rights, also cases related to massive violation of human rights, which have been also examined in her various academic publications. So we invited Professor Motoc and Professor Schmidt to reflect with us on the political and legal dimensions of the future of liberal democracy. And now it's time for me to give you the floor, maybe for 10 minutes, for a brief statements, and I will have the pleasure to moderate and dialogue with you together with Amandine Crespy, professor at the ULB, professor in political science and EU governance, and Paul Dermine, professor of European law, professor also at the ULB, both of them members of the Institute for European Studies. So I will stop here for this for this introduction. Professor Schmidt, dear Vivien, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be here. Delighted there's a large audience. And so I was asked, how can liberal democracies defend themselves? And for instance, how does one renew democratic practices? So this is not an easy question. And I think we have to start with the problem. And my sense is the problem is a loss of trust and legitimacy that accompanies the rise of the populist extremes that challenge liberal democracy. So the question is, how does one improve this, promoting better democratic practices as well as outcomes? Okay, but first, in order to figure that out, we need to ask why democratic practices need renewal, what kinds of democratic practices, and so what's at the basis of this? And so I think we need to look at the disenchantment of citizens, the loss of political trust in government institutions and practices. And so if we look at the politics of it, it's the distance between elites and the masses. Voting is increasingly seen as not really for citizens to be able to express their opinions, or at least to have their opinions heard. They seem to make little difference unless people protest in the street. But there also seems a lack of openness to civil society concerns, inclusiveness in policymaking. The parties no longer seem to be acting to represent citizens, and citizens have relatively few avenues to participate, especially in a multi-level EU where decisions seem to be made so far away from citizens. A number of years ago, I talked about the EU, this was in 2006 already, I was talking about the EU that at the national level, appeared to be politics without policy, as more and more policies were taken up at the EU level. And at the EU level, it was policy without politics. Okay, but things have changed since then, since 2006. Now we can see policy with politics at the EU level, and politics against policy at the national level, with increasing dissensus at both levels. And dissensus, of course, is the whole focus of this big project. But politicians no longer seem sufficiently responsive to citizens' concerns. On the economics, you have people who feel that they've not benefited from globalization and sort of neoliberal openness. We've seen the dualization of the labor force, with the richer getting richer and the poor not getting richer. So rising inequalities, the poor remaining poor, worried about making the ends meet in a time of inflation, and those in the middle seeing themselves slipping, which also then leads to sort of sociocultural worries about loss of social status, which then spills over into concerns about immigration and the changing faces of the nation. Beyond this, it sort of worries with loss of status, loss of pride, feeling disrespected. And this is fueled by views of politicians as corrupt, who don't care, who seem to be in it for themselves. But when we ask why this view of politicians, which is what the populists feed on, we actually can see this going way back to mainstream politicians who adopted a kind of neoliberal philosophy, which sees all politicians as rent-seeking. At the same time that politicians, that with the move to regulatory agencies, independence of experts, and expert agencies, if you will, politicians had less and less room for maneuver, and therefore found it harder to actually respond to the needs. I mean, you just look at the fiscal rules and sort of on deficit and debt, sort of increasingly limited capability. In particular, as you saw increasing cuts to social benefits, or at least sort of the post-war era of expanding benefits seemed to now to shift completely. So it made it easier for charismatic populist leaders who appeared authentic, plain speaking and all of that, to complain that technocrats are running everything and that the politicians are unaccountable and corrupt and in it for themselves. And with this, there also the attack on liberal institutions, checks and balances, saying that only with strong executives can you do anything. So sort of the move toward a more authoritarian. So anyway, all of this speaks to a loss of political trust and legitimacy. And if we ask, okay, so what is political trust? Two ways of thinking about it. It's diffuse support for a governing authority. And that's pretty stable, usually. You believe the government, but then there's specific support of governing authorities based on what they do, on their activities. And this is more dynamic and more differentiated. And it's differentiated between politicians and civil servants, where often there's more trust in civil servants who appear neutral than in politicians. But amongst politicians, there's often also a differentiation in trust, with those closer, municipal level, gaining more trust than those in government, let alone the EU, although in recent years you're actually seeing a shift. So the question is, how does one improve trust then in governing authorities? How do you reinforce the more general political trust that comes from actually trusting the governing authorities, who then can improve in terms of activities? And the reinforcement requires improving economic performance. But for that, we might ask, maybe we need to change the economic philosophy from neoliberalism to more progressivism, focus on sustainability. We've actually seen that turn in the EU, especially at the moment of the COVID crisis, where there was the green, sort of essentially brought out sustainability concerns, the Green New Deal, and what was it? It was about promoting green. It was about, what was it? sustainability, digitalization, and addressing social inequalities. But right now, we're beginning to see a bit of pushback on that as well. But all of this is essentially necessary, one could argue, in order to counter reactionary conservatism. You know, how do you do that? Maybe, good question. We'll leave it there for that one, but move on. You know, so it's improving the quality, improving the economic performance, the quality of the procedures. We've talked about this today. Papers we're talking about needing more accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, and openness. And that's true at the EU level, in particular in terms of the institutional, in terms of the Council, but also the Commission, and of course in national institutions. And beyond that, it's the quality of the political practices. One needs to bring citizens back into decision-making. And there have been attempts at that. The Conference on the Future of Europe, deliberative assemblies, citizens' petitions, but none of that's actually sufficient, it seems to me. There needs to be more to bring back citizens into the decision-making process at all levels, not just at the EU level, although that is clearly really necessary, much more democratization at the EU level, but also at the national level, to bring governing closer to the citizens. Beyond that, we probably need new leaders, able to speak to people's concerns with authenticity and charisma, but not the kind that we've seen to this date. I sort of laughingly talk about joyful charisma and truthful authenticity, but we need new politicians who can invent that. But again, many more avenues for participation, greater pluralism. Need to rethink the political institutions, but also to decentralize decision-making. What we've seen is increasing centralization, but in fact, I think citizens really want more decentralization, bring decisions closer to the citizens. But, you know, we can go on about other problems, but I won't, but social media, the polarization of traditional media, the extremes, in particular on the extremes of the right, have the upper hand on the discourse that promotes dissensus. So one needs to also find ways to make social media more user-friendly in an attempt to promote democracy. But how do you do this? Will regulating more do it? Or maybe creating new AI platforms that are actually European platforms with different algorithms? Okay, but that's, I think, probably enough ideas for the moment.
Thank you very much for covering so many aspects of the political dimension. Now I will turn to Judge Motoc for the legal perspective, and please, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Ramona. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the RED-SPINEL for this wonderful project. I have to say from the beginning that I have limitations where I speak because I'm still a judge at the International Criminal Court. So as you know, I have the obligation of reserve. I will address an issue from the legal perspective. As you know very well, I was professor many years in political science department, but I was never converted into political science completely. I can understand political science, but I will talk about the legal dimension and the legal dialogue nowadays in Europe. And I will talk about a dialogue mainly between the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, and between these two courts and the National Court. And I will start with a very concrete question. I will start with a concrete question that is not yet resolved, which is the question of the rule of law. So this crisis of the rule of law, as you know very well, you, Ramona, have written about this from the political science perspective, started in Central and Eastern Europe more in 2010 2011 already by the changes of the judges of the Constitutional Court of Hungary, following by even stronger crisis of in Poland, very magnified by the fact that judges of the Constitutional Court of Poland, they were changed, they were moved, they were the creation of a new chamber at the level of the Supreme Court of Poland. So basically the whole system was changed suddenly. I will say that in Poland this kind of change were more subtle, but in Poland they were very, very direct. We know very well that following this crisis we had reactions. We had first reactions, and I'll speak now about the courts. We had first reactions by the European Court of Justice, and this is very interesting because it is a question of independence and impartiality of the judiciary, but it was dealt by a court that was not meant to deal with human rights or in the independence and impartiality of the judiciary, which is the European Court of Justice. And we had a lot of cases in the for both countries, especially for Poland. We had few cases regarding a smaller crisis in Romania. Hungary was not so much touched by the court because the court were not very at ease. Even the European Court of Justice was not at ease with the problem of independence and impartiality of the judiciary, so they have to create first another case for regarding the judges from Portugal in order to enter into this question. Afterwards, after many years, I would say, the European Court of Human Rights reacted regarding Poland with several cases with the same issues like the European Court of Justice. We have to say that because the European Court of Human Rights had on their own agenda the question of independence and impartiality of the judiciary, that even before the crisis, the European Court of Human Rights had a case law regarding the freedom of expression of judges, and this is something very important question today nowadays as well. I will tell you afterwards why. So the European Court of Human Rights had several cases in the area of the freedom of expression of judges, including one of the judges that was also judge of the European Court of Human Rights, president of the Supreme Court of Hungary. That was one of the first judges dismissed by the new power, the famous case Baca. But for a while, the mission was taken by the European Court of Justice, and afterwards the European Court of Human Rights started a similar case law. The fact is that in this area of the rule of law, we had a strong opposition of the Polish Constitutional Court, and regarding the action of both courts, especially the European Court of Justice. As we know very well, this Polish Constitutional Court with the new judges had they inspired themselves to a certain extent by the famous decision of the German Constitutional Court in the saga Solange and afterwards. So they oppose, saying that the European Court of Justice acted ultra vires. So if you want, in this dialogue that was between the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights and the national courts, the Polish Constitutional Court, we have seen kind of dialogue almost perfect between the European Court of Human Rights and European Court of Justice, despite the fact that European Court of Human Rights has acted at the beginning, at the middle, it was the European Court of Justice, and afterwards it was again the European Court of Human Rights, and we saw a big opposition from the national judiciary, the Constitutional Court of Poland, which is, I would say, normal, because we talked here about this concept of liberal democracy, how these judges were appointed. We know that they are so-called fake, so nowadays the fake judges. So we had this democracy already putting in places this kind of judges called fake judges. On the other side, the main question regarding this issue of the rule of law, the big crisis of the rule of law in Europe, which is not solved yet, it is which mechanism we can have in place in order to execute the decisions of both courts. And we have to say that none of this mechanism worked from the beginning. We know that the European Union has created a lot of soft law mechanism, like the reports of the UN, like the action that can be taking place, like in between the state and the civil society. We know that the European Court of Human Rights has a mechanism of execution of their decision, which is very well established. We have a political mechanism that controls the execution of the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which is the Committee of Ministers. And this mechanism can send, and it sent twice, the case back to the European Court of Human Rights, and very severe sanction can be adopted. By that time, we had in the European Court of Human Rights one case regarding Azerbaijan Mamadov when this happened. But we know at the same time that the Committee of Ministers is a political body, and we need a very strong majority in order to have this mechanism of the execution, this strong mechanism installed. So this majority was not met in Polish case. So both executions, so both courts, despite all this very strong dialogue, which is a very rare dialogue, so strong at this level. Normally, both courts, they have a dialogue, but also they have area of divergency. But here they were not, almost zero. We see that and it's still impossible to execute this judgment, especially in a country like Poland. Despite the change of the regime, there were progress, they were done, but still the perfect mechanism in order to deal with the consequences of the installment of the judges that were not nominated in a legal way are still there. We have seen that in Hungary not much had happened. We have still the double of the numbers of the judges of the Constitutional Court, but it's not very effective because the power is the same. So we have seen that these were not these decisions were not executed. And also we have kind of case law more of the European Court of Justice regarding Romania that was not executed. So the question was really, it is for me, I think if we think about the solidity of a democracy, if we think about construction, reconstruction of a country, if we think about legitimacy, we start with the rule of law, where the mechanism of the rule of law are weak. We cannot build a democratic system, because everything will be afterwards ruined, because nothing will be able, not mechanism will be able to function in this country. So I think the question that it has maybe to be addressed, and I will address to the political scientists there, is how we can reinforce even more the mechanism of the executions of European decisions in order to have at least fundamental cases that are dealt in the same way by the two courts enforced. This is one of the, I think, major concern that I have, because I think that this question can, at a certain moment, threaten maybe also democracy that are consolidated in Europe. We can see that this scenario will happen, and we are going to see that we don't have really, I think, the mechanism that are able, despite all the creativity. Maybe one of the possibility that maybe we can take into account, it will be that once the European Union will be a part of the European Convention of Human Rights, which was, as you know very well, was rejected by the European Court of Justice in 2013, and now the discussions are there, but they are very complicated discussion. Maybe then they can find a solution at this level. But I think, the question is open. For me, is the first question, because now I will turn back to my practical experience as a UN expert. I think that in all the countries that I have been and I dealt with violation of human rights, I think that in all of them, the other violation of human rights, they followed the question of the rule of law and of independence and impartiality of judiciary. So once you, for instance, you want to rebuild in a country the health system, or you want to have a better redistribution system, as Vivien had explained before, you are just, if you don't have a very solid system of rule of law, of independence and impartiality of the judiciary, everything will be blocked. So I will stop here from the time being.
Thank you very much. Now I have the pleasure to address the first question. And you know, Vivien, we talk about a lot about the United States in Europe today. So my first question to you is, how do you see developments in the United States from Europe? And the other question, not from your perspective, from others' perspectives, how do Americans see Europe today? So that would be my first question, considering that this phenomenon that we described at the beginning is a global trend. And also what we showed in our research with RED-SPINEL is that there is a proliferation of illiberal or anti-liberal ideas, and you work on ideas. And also what RED-SPINEL shows is that Eastern Europeans now are exporters of ideas. They are no longer importers of ideas coming from the United States. So how do you see this from the United States? So that would be the question for you. And then Iulia, my question to you, so your presentation, thank you very much for this, focused on Central and Eastern Europe. So you mentioned Poland and mentioned Hungary and also other developments in Eastern Europe. And we had today a long discussion about East and West. And there is something which preoccupies us as academics and in political science. But I would like to ask you now, maybe, again, from an academic perspective, I understand that you have your role as a judge and probably there are some limits. But I would like to challenge you and to hear, how do you see developments in Western Europe, considering that there are also many changes in well-established democracies, and that maybe the role of judges and the rule of law is undermined or eroded from other angles and in different ways, probably not in the same way as we see it in Central and Eastern Europe. So my question to you would be to have a look at, to tell us a bit more about how do you see developments in Western Europe, and if there is an element of comparison with Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you. And maybe this time the reactions should be maybe shorter so that we have also time for the next round of questions from my colleagues and then questions from the audience. So Vivien, would you like to start?
Yeah, happy to. Just to say, I think you made it, before I start on the US views, which I'll start with, and in particular the Trumpian view, just to say, you're absolutely right to say that Central Eastern European dissensus hasn't simply stayed in Eastern Europe. It's not only moved west, but it's moved to the United States. And I mean, it's very interesting to see the way in which Orban has been a source of, let's say, mimesis by the Republican Party. There have been close contacts back and forth. There's actually, if we talk about the circulation of ideas, the Edmund Burke Foundation has created national conservative conferences that have brought together European and American leaders, in particular, European and American leaders on the extremes of the right. And Meloni and Orban and others have been regular speakers at these events. But that wasn't really the question you asked. It's how do people in the US view Europe? And then you asked me, how do I particularly see it? And so I'm going to give you the Trumpian view, because that's the only one that matters right now. And you know, the latest national security strategy tells it all, plus the political interview. Although none of it's much of a surprise, since Trump has already articulated a lot of what's in there, perhaps not in such detail, but you know, in his interview, he talks about Europe is decaying, largely because of immigration. He admires Orban in particular, because of his opposition to immigration. And there's a theme throughout this that's very much a kind of a racially tinted anti-immigration. I mean, we only need to have to talk about the fact that the U.S. now accepts very few refugees, and those who have priority are South African whites. But okay, what is the national security strategy? For those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it closely, when it focuses on the EU, which it doesn't get to until page 27, 28, something like that, the EU is in economic decline. Why? Because of its regulations, not because it's not invested sufficiently, which is really what the problem is. So it's because of its regulation, also because the EU is eclipsed, I'm quoting here, eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. Back to migration. And so migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, the censorship of free speech. What's that about? Because one can't make seriously racialized and their censorship of the extreme right is the perception. Suppression of political opposition, again, extreme right. And that's more the AfD sort of focus. Cratering birth rates, well, that is true. And loss of national identities and self-confidence. So this is all in the document. And so what the US wants to do is enable Europe, quote, I'm quoting again, Europe to stand on its own feet and operate as a group of aligned sovereign nations. Read, get rid of the EU. And it wants to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. So it's essentially pro-dissensus, pro-promoting the extreme right, whether as opposition parties or in government. So that's just the national security strategy. But beyond this, what's clear is the US doesn't trust, Europe is no longer the US's most trusted ally, even though the document at least claims that it wants a strong Europe as allies, trading partners for innovation, etc. But at the same time it said that, we certainly saw all of the tariffs and the discourse around the tariffs. That was about that Europe was basically, I guess I could say, screwing the US taking advantage of the US, and that therefore it needed to have punitive tariffs. Beyond that, Europe is seen as weak and divided and subject to civilization crisis. And then the vision of the world that Trump has, that comes out in the national security document, but has also been in the discourse for a very long time, is that the world needs to be a sort of zones of interest and influence, and probably only three: the US, maybe Russia, certainly China and Asia. And where is Europe in all of that? This is actually a very serious question for Europe, and for all the Europeans, whether political leaders or members of the Commission, who keep thinking that the US is that there's going to be an after Trump that's going to go back to the past. Not the case. Absolutely not. Within this new world order, the EU will be torn between the US, that's going to demand that it remain loyal, and China. Not exactly sure what it will demand, but certainly in terms of commercial ties, et cetera, at the same time that the EU itself is caught in an area. It's a region that has a very dangerous neighborhood around unless all of these wars get solved. But of course, Trump will solve them, not to worry. But there's a big question, where is Europe? But for Trump, back to Trump, the EU is seen as a threat to the idea of the nation state. The US, it's an example of the most successful supranational entity, but that's exactly why Trump is most concerned about the EU. The US is against multilateral arrangements. You can see for Trump, the only thing that's important is bilaterals. On top of that, I do seem to be going on a lot about this, but okay, the EU is seen as a threat to free speech, meaning moderate democratic and civil discourse. We've seen it already in the national security strategy, but the US promotes the extremes in Europe and hate speech, especially against immigrants. The EU is also seen as a threat on climate change because it believes that it's actually happening. And it's seeking to reduce fossil fuel, whereas the US model is now based on fossil fuels. And of course, the EU is also seen as a threat to US industrial policy, focused on AI and the tech bros, because the EU is seeking to regulate it. You've just seen it with the latest decision on AI. But okay, but that's all Trump. Now what about me? From the US viewing Europe, that was the question. So I also see the EU as weak. And that's because many political leaders still believe that they can count on the US. The EU needs to take much more positive action, and not only in terms of speaking, but also doing. In the discourse, it needs to push back on Trumpian illiberalism, to assert its liberal values, and to protect rule of law in particular. But on industrial policy, it actually needs European AI and European platforms, and cannot, and I think that's a really important piece, cannot rely simply on the US or on China with TikTok. But the EU also needs better, smarter defense and security. I guess the question is, does it really need to spend 5% of GDP on armaments? What happens to the welfare state when it does that? It might think more, not simply about spending at the national level, but rethinking security and defense across Europe to get rid of duplication of armies and navies and all of that, and really think about setting a EU capacity, not just having member states spend individually, but find ways to spend collectively. And do all of this, as opposed to constant belt tightening for countries without the fiscal space. We need The EU needs EU-level debt sharing, safe assets, common borrowing, Eurobonds. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to use that word. But okay, beyond that, I also see increasing dangers from the ongoing dissensus, the impact of the extremes on the right, on agenda setting, especially with regards not only to immigration, where we're seeing a constant move to the right and to the sort of the long-term agenda of the extreme right, but we also see it in terms of social policy and the dangers there of backsliding in terms of human rights of all kinds. And I guess sort of to finish on this, what happens in 2027 when a majority of countries governing, either alone in coalition, could very well be on the extreme right? Will this lead to the destruction of the EU because there are Eurosceptic, attacking its foundational values? Will this be a going back to the Europe of nations? Or will it be a stalemate, simply a stalemate, making it impossible for the EU to move forward because the extremes don't actually agree amongst themselves on what to do and where to go? Or, okay, I need to be positive once in a while, could they recognize that they too need the EU? Not simply because they're afraid of Brexit and what happens to a country that leaves, but rather, how do you deal with the threats from an unstable neighborhood? And beyond that, where the US, the world hegemon, has decided to give up its hegemony in favor of these three zones of influence, and in which the EU has little place. So can the EU still move forward? Whatever its changing values, we don't want to go there. Because if not, it will become a medieval amusement park for Americans and Chinese and everyone else. And that would be a very sad end. I think I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you very much, Iulia. 3-4 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yes, so it is what I wanted to say is that at the level, to answer to Vivien more, it's at the level of the promotion and protection of human rights, because I talked only about very limited things. I think that we see in Europe at all the level of international courts, majority of national courts, advancement, a lot of advancement in terms of the promotion and the protection of human rights. And we see the European Court of Justice traditionally that create the European Union now is the mechanism that was behind the creation of the European Union, as we said, took away in the small kingdom of Luxembourg. It's expanding extraordinary in terms of protection of human rights, even in areas that before were not tackled, like gender protection, artificial intelligence, migrant was tackled before. But these were, at the same time, the European Court of Human Rights also. And you see, for instance, crucial decision that there were at the international level, but started by the European Court of Human Rights in the area of climate change, adopted last year. And we saw the same reaction at the level of European International Court of Justice. So if I look to the advancement of the human rights in terms of migrants' rights, in terms of vulnerable groups' rights, I see advancement at all levels of both European life. I do not see yet this regression that was at a certain moment, but now I feel that both courts are working in this direction. So I will not share the same pessimism from a human rights perspective. On the other, the question that you put me, it is still I think a political science question. I will answer that indeed they are problems related to independence and impartiality in the what I call everybody calls the consolidated democracies, but and this question, even the cases at the level of the European Court of Justice and European Court of Human Rights had one Portuguese case, I quoted, and one Icelandic case regarding nomination of judges. But the scale at the level of non-respecting independence and impartiality of judiciary were minimal one, comparing to the scale that exists at this country, as we know. And here it's a very sophisticated discussion, but we see that even in countries that they have certain government nowadays, the judicial is still very strong and opposed in a lot of these consolidated democracies.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Ramona, for having me on the panel. It's a great pleasure to be part of this very important conversation. Vivien, in your introductory talk, you started to touch upon this a bit, but I'd like to focus now on the interactions between national democracies and the EU. And the question that keeps running through my mind is the following. Does the EU have an added value when it comes to democracy? Can it have one? Should we expect it to have one? So to explain briefly the question, after World War II, regional integration in Europe was not only a project of peace and prosperity, but also the idea was to settle for long-lasting democracy after experiencing fascism on the continent. And of course, decision makers within the EU institutions have repeated oftentimes that democracy is the founding value of the Union, and the Union has developed a legal and political arsenal for promoting and defending democracy. And yet, today, we have 3 different nationalist political groups in the European Parliament. Recently pieces of legislation, the deregulatory agenda, the omnibus, was adopted by a majority made of the conservatives and the far right for the first time. We can expect more of those majorities to come. So very clearly the return of anti-democratic forces is not only the defect of national democracies, it has now also permeated the entire EU political system. So my question is, what does this mean for the European Union as an institution? Is it that it has failed to replace nationalism with an alternative project? Or does dissensus have anything to do with the technocratic nature of the Union? Was it from the outset perhaps naive to think that the Union, especially as it has turned increasingly intergovernmental, would have some kind of democratic added value that would supersede national politics? And to push that argument a bit further, I've had conversations, with colleagues and friends, even arguing, well, if people vote in elections in national arenas and the EU is reflecting this, well, perhaps after all, it's more of a good news than a bad news. Was it naive to think the Union would be more than the sum of its parts?
That's a very complicated question and a long one. And I think the EU is more than the sum of its parts. But when the parts break apart, then it's no longer the sum of its parts. And I think we're facing a moment when that's what's happening. That the member states, there's increasing, it's not just dissensus, but it's polarization amongst the member states, but also within the member states. And when you have that, how do you reach, and for an EU that is based on consensus and compromise, when you have more and more member states amongst themselves, but then within the member states, the inability or unwillingness to compromise, you're in trouble, especially when that polarization is reflecting increasingly deep differences in values. So I think that's one part of the answer there. And I think, Iulia was saying this, you were saying this, the EU's democratic value is based in its democratic rules and regulations, and it's focused on solidarity and a fair playing field, on its fundamental values in terms of human rights, but also the Copenhagen criteria. But part of the problem is that the EU needs to continue to make good on all of this. The EU, and this is, our manner of speaking is as if the EU is different from the member states, but the EU is its member states, and that's where the problems lie. So I want to reiterate something I said in the previous discussion, just very briefly. What happens if the council in the next, what happens if the council in the next electoral cycle, we're talking 2027, when the French have elections, if we get a majority of Eurosceptic extreme right parties, whether tied to conservatives or ruling on their own, what if there's a majority there? And what if in the next EU elections, a couple years later, what happens if the Commission has a majority of Eurosceptic and dissensus-focused commissioners? And what happens if the majority in the EP, which it will reflect, is that? It's so, in a way, I think it's dangerous to assume that democratic values last and that laws are inviolable, even if you've got the Court of Human Justice, the Court of European, ECJ, the Court of Justice and the Court of Human Rights and all of that. Laws can be reinterpreted, rules can be perverted. Just look at the U.S. The U.S., in the U.S., there's a semblance of following the rules, but are they really, and the law? I mean, we needn't end up in a total relativism where there are no universal values, but where might trumps right, and I liked using the word the trumps in there as well, might trumps right. But we're in a dangerous moment. Just look at what's happening in the U.S. And I just want to list things very quickly because I've been obsessed with what's happening in the U.S., but I think you should be too. And if you're not there, you don't realize how much is happening. But so I just want to remind you, since taking office, the Trump administration, this is sort of a warning to us all about what could also happen in European member states and arguably in the EU itself. Since taking office, in a very short time, Trump has virtually upended the U.S. constitutional order, together with the policies and procedures long seen as sacrosanct, using Project 2025 that was developed by the by the Heritage Foundation as a blueprint. And so what has it done? It's undermined the separation of powers key to liberal democracy, with a push for overarching executive power in the theory of the unitary executive. It's engaged in massive firings of civil servants and closures of countless programs. It's politicized the military and militarized ICE and the Border Patrol, and it's created essentially an independent army that is beholden only to the executive. It's weakened the rule of law, weaponizing the Justice Department against so-called enemies, politicizing the judiciary and engaging in lawfare. It's challenged academic freedom with cuts of billions of dollars in scientific research. It's pushed revisions of historical memory in schools, museums, slavery, Native Americans. Talking about that is seen as anti-American ideology. It's threatened that you can stop me at any time, but I'll keep going. It's threatened the freedom of the press. Reporters are seen as enemies of the people and purveyors of fake news. It's eliminated long-standing anti-discrimination programs, DEI, at the very beginning. It's eliminated research and policy implementation on climate change with drill, baby, drill. It's extended tax cuts for the very rich while cutting social services and health benefits through its budget-busting, big, beautiful bill. It's engaged in extensive self-enriching corruption by the Trump family. And we see this, over and over and over again. There's the interference, I almost forgot, interference with the electoral system. Not only the big lie on the 2020 election, but massive amounts of voter suppression and redistricting now across the states to try to get a Republican victory in the midterm elections. And if that doesn't happen, we could see, sort of in my nightmares, middle of the night I wake up thinking, maybe they'll just, if they're losing, they'll declare a national emergency and stop the elections and send in the National Guards from the Republican states to the Democratic-controlled urban areas. And then there will be killings. And then there really will be a national emergency. But who's going to win? And so, okay, I've got to stop there. It's getting too grim. But that's happened in such a short time. That could happen in Europe. That has happened in certain European countries, not quite like that. But it could happen. So this is a warning, and I guess the question for Europe is, do you sit back and watch it and think it can't happen here? Or do you start taking steps to ensure that it won't happen here?
Thanks a lot, Ramona, and from my side as well, thanks a lot for having me in this fantastic and important panel. Actually, the question I have for Judge Motoc is a good follow-up to what Vivien just told us. So Judge Motoc, in your remarks, you primarily touched upon the rule of law, judicial independence, fundamental rights protection, the pressure they are under, and the reaction that this has triggered from a number of important international courts here in Europe, the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, and also the limits of these reactions. Now, my question would be more about democracy itself, liberal democracy, which is the concept at the core of the RED-SPINEL project. And the question I'd have for you is how you think courts as institutions should react when the democratic model is under threat. Now, over the past few years, we've seen some spectacular developments with courts making very bold moves to protect democracy. You've mentioned the European Court of Justice, which has developed very offensive lines of case law regarding the rule of law, but also very offensive lines of case law regarding democracy, electoral rights, and the freedom of the press, for example. If you cross the Atlantic, in Brazil recently, the Supreme Federal Court went as far as temporarily blocking X for its attack on the democratic rule of law. And in your own country, Romania, the Constitutional Court annulled the first round of the presidential election in December 2024 because of possible Russian interference via social media. Some hailed the decision as the only correct one, while others rejected it as a formalized coup d'etat crushing the very essence of democracy, I quote. And in contrast to that, we've seen in other corners of the world courts less ready to engage with these fights, the US Supreme Court being, I believe, a prime example. So we'd be very interested to hear your views as someone with extensive judicial experience at the national level, at the European level, and now at the international level in the International Criminal Court. To hear your views on the role of judges in defending liberal democracy. How militant should they be? How offensive should they be? What are the constraints which inhibit their capacity to act, and what are the limits in how far they should or should not go in that context? Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Because I was in touch with political scientists, I will say that this is, despite the fact that it's about the court, this is a political science question. The role of the courts. I think, and I have to think in this way, that court, because I am somebody who has a liberal mind. The courts have a fundamental role in protecting democracies, and I will go back to I'm not so pessimistic even regarding the future of the EU that was built by a court, because as you know very, very much, the rules, the principles of the rules primacy and all the other very important principles that are fundamental for European Union were built by the cases of the European Court of Justice. First of all, it was Costa Enel. Afterwards, it was the development of the EU. So I think that it's not very easy, this is my point, it's not very easy to demolish international court. It's not very easy to erase international judges there. It is to put some judges in, I cannot speak about countries or something else, to have some judges nominated in times at a certain courts. And the fact that the what it was called, liberal democracy, can come back is we have this example in Europe, and we have the example of Poland, where nowadays, as I told you, they are dealing to how to reverse all the decision taken by the fake judges and to go back to their principle. So we see that sometimes we have this courts can be also changed. It's easier to change national courts than to change international court. I don't know in the history none of the example where judges of an international court were nominated. I have to remind you that for instance, the both courts, the European Court of Human Rights and European Court of Justice, have a very severe system of selection. It means that if a government will have candidates, a list of persons that do not have a record of protection of human rights and democracy, this list will not be accepted. And it happened 3 years with Poland, for instance, at the European Court of Human Rights, and almost 3 years at the European Court of Justice. It means that there are mechanisms not to have these judges that don't have a record of human rights nominated at international courts. These do not exist so much at the level of national courts. They don't have the same safeguard. But if I have to look at the architecture, at the European architecture, I have to say that we cannot see a pure and simple separation between the national system of judges and the two supranational courts like European Court of Justice and European Court of Human Rights. We know very well that the judges of the national judges, they raise questions to the European Court of Justice, maintenant also to the European Court of Human Rights. So the systems are entangled. So you cannot say that so this architecture for me is a very solid architecture. And I will go back to this expression because I don't come from the political science field, I come from the law field. I don't know, because in legal terms, this expression written by Erich Stein back in the 70s in the American Journal of International Law is very famous, tucked away in the small kingdom of Luxembourg. I say that even if we, at the first glance, we have the tendency to ignore this mechanism. This mechanism, that the Court of Justice was the most important mechanism in the development of the EU. And here we have, I think, we have both. We don't have only the legal minds, but we have also, for instance, American author like Andrew Moravich. I will speak only about him from the neoliberal perspective, what he is talking about. So this is quite accepted by the field, what we call European integration in Europe, all these fields, because this is the reality of the development of the EU law. So this is the reason I don't see so much because of this architecture and because the possibility to have these liberal judges, and for the time being they are there, and in the places that the place were taking, they go back by the voice of the European courts majority. I think that the system is that legal architecture of Europe in this moment, at least, is quite solid and different from a state being this state, federal states, or what you want to call. I say that I cannot enter into politics at all.
Thank you very much. Now I think it's time to turn to the audience and see if there are some questions and remarks. And if you agree, I would propose to collect all the questions. Please introduce yourself, and I will come to you with the microphone. I don't have to do that. Thank you, Frederick. So the microphone is in the room. I saw the first hand. Yeah, there are already 3 hands, 4 hands. So if I can ask you, try to be brief, introduce yourself and brief question. And 4 questions already. And if there are many others, we will see if we have time for a second round. But for the first round, we start with the 4 questions. So, Professor
Thank you very much. I'm Gabor Halmai. So the question is related to Vivien's two different statements. Both are true. So first, she was talking about the playbook of Orban, somehow repeated through the Edmund Burke Foundation and other places towards the American conservative, or I don't know, audiences. So my question is, do you really think that the threat to liberal democracy in Europe and elsewhere has a real ideological agenda? In other words, what is happening in the US currently, and what happened in Hungary in the last 15 years, does it have, besides some populist rhetorical background, does it have a real ideological background? Is it conservatism of Edmund Burke or any other conservatives? Or this is nothing else but authoritarianism? What you listed at the very last contribution, what is happening in the US today, this is nothing else but autocratic pursuit. And I think that neither Orban nor Trump has any ideological background. They want to have an unlimited power, and not even for the sake of their national interest, for the sake of a very, very narrow business interest of their oligarchs or their kleptocrats or whatever. So is there any ideological challenge for liberal democracy, either from Orban or Trump? Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Claudia Badulescu, postdoctoral researcher here on the RED-SPINEL project. I would have a question for Judge Motoc. Thank you very much for being here. Bună seara. You have surely followed the huge scandal unfolding now in the judicial sector from Romania, following the revealing of a documentary, basically an investigative journalism documentary showing the extent to which the justice is captured in Romania by oligarchs and political figures. I would like to hear from you, well, if you can give us an opinion of how you see this, this crisis unfolding, and more importantly, should the EU react? Should the EU institutions, maybe the European Court of Justice, react to what is happening now, and how? And do you think it will react in any way? Thank you.
So I'm going to answer first.
We will take all the questions and then we will give you a bit of time to respond. So there are 4 questions because, I'm sorry for this, you don't see probably the room, so there are 5 questions in the room and we will try to have all of them and then you will see what you can do in the time we will have. Serafine, please.
Thank you so much. I'm Serafine. I'm a PhD student at the ULB. And I'm sorry, but I have 2 questions, but that only speaks to the excellence of this panel. That I would love to hear your views on this. So the first question would be to Vivien, and it connects well to the previous question. After you've listed all these measures that the Trump administration has been doing over the past few months, I'm wondering if what your view is on whether we don't need to use the term fascism, and whether we're moving towards that system, and whether it actually makes sense to talk about threats to liberal democracy and dissensus when perhaps it might be even darker than that. And my second question would be to Judge Motoc. I'm not sure you will be able to comment a lot on that, but you could also be very abstract in your response. Because we've seen that the US has imposed sanctions on a number of judges of the ICC and prosecutors. And we, of course, know that the US has never been the biggest fan of the ICC with the whole Hague Invasion Act and so on in previous administrations. But I would be really interested in hearing your take on what you think that this means for the international legal order and criminal justice in particular. Thank you very much.
Another question. Please introduce yourself. Yes.
Hello, it's Álvaro Leart. I'm a postdoctoral researcher also at the Institute for European Studies of the ULB. Thanks a lot for this discussion. So I have one question for Vivien. And you know, I'm a big fan of your work. And I was wondering what, if you would be at the head of the Social Democrats, be it at the European level or at the Democrats, you know, in the US, what would you do to confront some of these kind of strategies? Because I'm thinking, because at the European level, in European politics, we have had this kind of traditional coalition between pro-Europeans, kind of the center-left, centrist and center-right. But clearly, as Amandine was kind of hinting, well, there's kind of been a shift. And I think only yesterday, I think Keir Starmer also was publishing a piece with the Prime Minister of Denmark, basically kind of calling for Social Democrats to halt migration as well. So in some ways, the mainstream is already far right, and the Democrats, in spite of some things like Zoran Mamdani's kind of victory, have also been a little bit weak. So I was wondering, what would be your thoughts if you would be, at the head of the Democrats or the Social Democrats? Thanks.
Hello, I am Eliana Zatschler, Associate Professor of EU Law at University of West of Timișoara. And I would like to first congratulate Professor Coman on organizing and hosting this timely conference. I have a question for Judge Motoc. Bună seara.
Bună seara.
Considering that the European judges went to court, to the ECJ especially, on the 2nd of December this year, to defend their independence. And it was for the first time in history that they did that. How do you comment, how would you like to comment what is going on in Europe, Poland, but also Romania right now? Thank you.
I think this concludes the first round of questions, and I don't think we will have time for a second round, so we have 8 minutes. But before giving you the floor, maybe in the reverse order, Iulia, you first, maybe 4 minutes if possible, and then we save some time for Vivien. I would like to say that when we designed this project, we didn't have in mind to say that dissensus is fascism and autocratization. So I feel the need to say that because it is a beautiful word, dissensus, but it is very often associated with that. Now, I don't want to take more time, so Iulia, please, the floor is yours, maybe briefly.
Yes,
thank you.
I would say hello to Carbohydrate. First of all, I didn't know that I didn't saw and to the colleagues. I have to say that me here, I am kind of anti-guest because, as I said from the beginning, I cannot talk, and I cannot talk about things that normally I would like to talk. So one of the things that I cannot talk, of course, because of my function, is the crisis, the judicial crisis that is now going on in Romania. What I can say, because the first questions were about the legal mechanism. If you remember the previous smaller crises that there were, we have to have a powerful judiciary that is able to address a preliminary question to the European Court of Justice, because otherwise is more complicated to have an answer. And of course, this takes time. But first of all, we have to have judges that are not afraid that they are going to have disciplinary punishment or things like this. And please, maybe you have noticed that regarding Romania, that Monday, the 15th of December, European Court of Human Rights is going to publish a very important judgment for all Europe, but also for Romania, Danileț against Romania. It's about one judge that was excluded because of his freedom of expression for the class of magistrates, and now we have the Grand Chamber also tackling the freedom of expression, the disciplinary sanction, but also social media, because he made remarks on social media. So it's an important judgment. Please read the judgment on the 15th of December. So here I can, unfortunately, I have short time. Regarding the US sanction, the court has a position, of course, that all of us judges of the ICC, we have solidarity with our colleagues that are in this situation. We had the Assembly of the State Party, several the colleagues also, the presidency of the court, all the colleagues have expressed themselves. That is something really dramatic to see yourself as a judge in line with the drug dealers and terrorists and all the others being sanctions. We have colleagues that were all over in the press regarding this issue. So I think that the position of the court is clear. The presidency of the ICC is working very hard with the member states in order to have the support of the member states, and in order to avoid in order to articulate EU again reaction if the sanction, as it was said at a certain moment, will be regard also the court as a whole. So I think the court is working to limit the effect of these sanctions. So I have a lot in. If you want, as I said, if I will not be able to have a lot to comment about this, but also time is limited, and Vivien has very interesting questions.
Thank you, Vivien.
Yes. So thanks for these questions. I'll do it very quickly. So Gabor, great question. Do I think that the threat to liberal democracy has a real ideological agenda? Definitely, yes. And we can see it, the sort of the National Conservatives, it's the Edmund Burke Foundation, but it's not just that. It's social conservatism, pro-family, anti-LGBT, even as many different, you get different specifics of content in different countries. For example, on welfare, some are welfare chauvinists, others are much more neoliberal and just want to cut the welfare state. But you asked, is it also autocratic? Is it a power grab? It's definitely also a power grab. But although these charismatic leaders may be pragmatists and narcissists, certainly Trump is, they're also enablers of deeply conservative ideas. And their special advisors, the organic intellectuals in Gramsci's terms, do have ideology. Whether it's Steve Bannon for Trump, or it's Curtis Yarvin, a reactionary conservative, who convinced first Peter Thiel, who then convinced J.D. Vance, who is kind of the thinking man behind Trump. I mean, all of that, it seems to me, is that there's not perhaps one single coherent ideology, but it's a cluster of conservative ideologies. In the U.S., you can add the evangelicals, and the anti-abortion. And it seems to me it's a package of ideas that mean that there's an ideology. And on top of that, if you think about the style itself, the us versus them, the anti-liberal democracy, anti-intermediation between me, the leader, and you, my people, Pierre Rosanvallon talks about that as a strong ideology. So it's not just the content, but even arguably in the political style, it's an anti-liberal ideology that expresses itself and that destroys the institution simply in that, in the political style of discourse. So I think that's important. Next, second question, do we need to use another term? Fascism. We're getting close. And certainly, I'm notionally writing a book on populism, and I've increasingly started thinking, can I really use that term anymore? And I've actually talked to various so-called populists in Italy, for example, and sort of gone back one year after another and asked the Five-Star Movement people, so are you populists? First year, yes. Second year, yes. Third year, no, we're progressives. Okay, that sounds good to me. But on the other side, I talked to the Fratelli d'Italia. Are you populists? Well, maybe. Then the next year, no, we're national conservatives. I talked to the Lega. Are you populists? Yes, one year. Yes, the next year. The next year, no, we're national conservatives. And I say, how can you say that? Look at what Salvini's, populist style. Yeah, we're trying to calm him down. We're national conservatives. So already populism doesn't work quite as much because they are reconceiving themselves. And here's back to the ideology thing. But also, on top of that, the kinds of things they want to do suggests a much stronger move toward fascism. And yet, fascism is an old term. It's the strategic use of violence. I immediately have to think of Mussolini. This is not the strategic use of violence, or at least not yet. I think that if you look at what's happening in the US, we're getting closer. And the question is, at what point does it really become fascist, if we want to use the technical term? And then finally, for Alvaro, if I were the head of the Social Democrats in Europe, or of the US Democrats, what would I do? Pray. But seriously, you're right, the mainstream is moving toward the right against immigration. I think that's a big mistake, although there needs to be a way to address this in a different way. The discourse needs to shift, but it shouldn't follow the extremist. discourse. Mandami is a great breath of fresh air. He works for New York City. That might not work for everywhere, and I think that's where one needs to talk about the Social Democrats and the US Democrats going back to the grassroots. You know, they have become so, they have moved so far away from the people that I think, you know, they need to begin to think about where are the people. And that's what made Mandami, but not just Mandami in New York, but also Democratic, you know, successful races for governor in the Midwest where Democrats won. They all talked about affordability. They're all talking about, okay, we need to listen to where people are and what they want. But you can't just follow, you need to lead. But you need to lead in a progressive way. But for that, you need to address what people's concerns are. And for way too long, the Social Democrats and the US Democrats, in particular the US Democrats, weren't listening. They were telling. This is also a bit the technocratic bent, too much reliance on consultants, technocrats, telling them what to say, how to say it. It's a disaster. No, you need, and in that way, maybe we need to go back to new leaders, young people, or younger people, actually coming up. But that also means a sort of a generational shift.
Thank you very much, Vivien. Merci beaucoup, Paul and Amandine. Mulțumesc foarte mult, Iulia. And thank you to all of you for your questions and for this very, very interesting discussion. This is the end of our panel on the future of liberal democracy from a political science and legal perspective. Now, tomorrow, to promote the project, we will talk about other things, policy recommendations for EU institutions. This is why we chose this venue. Also, foresights, how civil servants and officials portray or conceive the futures of the EU, and all more research academic work that we produce as part of RED-SPINEL. So I invite you to join us tomorrow if you want for the rest of our conference. I look forward to our discussions maybe tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, I think in the next months, because dissensus is here to stay, and I think the concept will survive after RED-SPINEL, I'm afraid. So thank you very, very much for your participation this evening, and I will invite you to join us for a drink and to continue this conversation at the reception. So thank you, and see you maybe tomorrow.